The Mississippi Delta does not swallow people loudly. It absorbs them. Water there moves through cypress knees and black channels in slow, deliberate currents, carrying silt thick enough to erase detail within hours. In late summer, the air hangs heavy, pressing heat down into the marsh until every breath feels borrowed. Sheriff Cole Maddox had worked the Delta long enough to know the difference between a body lost to accident and a body taken by intention. The first disappearance came in June, unofficial at first. 2 men from upriver who had been cited previously for illegal netting in protected backwater channels never returned from a night run. Their aluminum skiff was found wedged in reeds near a narrow oxbow inlet. No gunshots reported, no overturned hull, just blood smeared along the inside rail and one boot floating 10 yards downstream. Fish and Wildlife labeled it a likely dispute, or accidental fall followed by gator activity. That explanation held for exactly 3 weeks. The second boat was discovered farther south, in a channel so tight that overhanging branches scraped both sides of the hull when the tide rose. This time, there were drag marks in mud leading from shallow water to deeper black pool beneath cypress shade. Sheriff Maddox crouched near that mark and studied the impression. It was not random churn from struggling men. It was a single heavy slide, wide, smooth, continuous. Something large had anchored, twisted, and pulled. Alligators in the Delta are common. Large ones are not rare, but most follow predictable feeding behavior. Ambush at edge, roll, submerge, retreat to deeper water. They do not consistently target boats. They do not repeatedly engage adult men unless conditioned or territorial beyond typical threshold. Maddox ordered deputies to canvass quietly for information on the missing men. The pattern emerged slowly. Both groups had histories of poaching along restricted backwater channels known for illegal trot lines and night gigging. Both boats were found within 5 miles of each other, along tributaries feeding into the same slow-moving basin, locals called Blacktooth Bend. The name predated the sheriff's tenure, an old fisherman's reference to submerged logs that tore nets apart like teeth. But when Maddox stood at the edge of that basin at dusk, he saw something else beneath the surface. Movement too slow to ripple fully, a darker mass drifting between cypress roots where the water deepened abruptly. The third disappearance removed coincidence entirely. A pair of known night hunters failed to check in after running spotlight rigs along the same basin. Their flat-bottom boat was discovered intact, engine still functional, lights smashed inward from below. No shell casings, no signs of gunfire exchange, just a crescent fracture in the aluminum hull near the waterline and a deep gouge along the stern where something had struck with force. Maddox ran his fingers along the dent and felt the inward curl of metal. Alligators can launch vertically with explosive power when attacking prey, silhouetted against surface light. If poachers were shining spotlights into dark water, they could have been presenting targets. But 3 separate events along overlapping channels suggested territory, not random opportunism. Maddox requested sonar mapping of the basin's deepest pocket. The equipment revealed a depression nearly 20 feet down at its center, deeper than surrounding marsh channels. That kind of pocket can house a large male comfortably, especially one that has established dominance and minimal competition. Large male alligators defend feeding zones aggressively during peak season. If that male had learned that night boats equaled easy prey, fish, bait, or distracted men leaning over rails, the behavioral line could shift. Maddox returned alone at twilight 2 days later, cutting his engine 100 yards from the basin and drifting silently along the cypress fringe. The delta at dusk changes texture. Insects rise in thick clouds, frogs fall silent, and water flattens into ink. He saw the eyes first, two faint amber reflections hovering just above the surface near a cluster of submerged roots. The distance between them was wide, too wide for a juvenile. The eyes did not sink when he drifted closer. They remained fixed, tracking. Then the head surfaced fully, broad, scarred across the snout, one ridge of old healed damage near the left orbital socket. The body length beneath the surface extended farther than expected, tail motion barely perceptible. Maddox counted at least 13 feet without full exposure, possibly more. The animal did not flee at engine vibration. It sank slowly and reappeared 10 yards off his stern, repositioning without splash. That was not casual basking behavior. That was assessment. Over the next hour, as light drained from the basin, the alligator surfaced 3 separate times in near-perfect arcs around the same central depression mapped by sonar, each surfacing aligned with subtle current seams that would carry scent and vibration outward. Territory patrol. Maddox understood then that if the missing men had leaned over rails with fish blood on hands, if they had dumped illegal catch overboard or cleaned gear in that basin repeatedly, they could have reinforced association. And a dominant male that links boat silhouette and spotlight glare with food does not abandon that advantage easily. The delta does not erase patterns. It buries them in mud and lets them surface again under the right conditions. And as darkness sealed over Blacktooth Bend, Sheriff Cole Maddox felt less like he was investigating a disappearance and more like he was stepping into a feeding ground claimed by something that had already learned the routine of the men who hunted there illegally. Sheriff Cole Maddox did not believe in coincidence inside a wetland that large. Not when 3 separate boats had been found within the same 5-mile stretch of backwater, and not when each incident involved men who operated illegally after dark, leaning over rails with blood on their hands and light beams cutting across still water. Blacktooth Bend was not an open river corridor. It was a basin system fed by narrow channels that funneled current in predictable arcs, creating scent lines that lingered longer than they should in moving water. Maddox returned at dawn with 2 deputies and a wildlife biologist named Dr. Rachel Kinsey, who had studied large male alligator territoriality along the lower delta for over a decade. They ran sonar again across the deepest pocket and confirmed what the first scan had suggested. A depression carved by slow rotational current, nearly 20 feet down at its center, surrounded by shallower shelves where fish and turtles often congregated. Kinsey explained quietly that dominant males will often hold such depressions as core territory, surfacing along perimeter arcs to monitor vibration. Maddox listened, but kept replaying the gouged aluminum hull in his mind. Alligators strike from below when prey is silhouetted against light, especially during night activity. A poacher leaning over a boat edge to retrieve a line presents a vertical target. If the animal is large enough and conditioned enough, it may escalate beyond opportunistic bite into full rollover and submerge. The deputies found more detail along the mud bank where the second boat had been discovered. The drag mark was wide and unbroken, indicating sustained pull rather than multiple scattered attempts. There were no scattered footprints suggesting chase along land. Whatever had taken the men had done so from water, and returned to water immediately. That consistency tightened the pattern further. Maddox ordered quiet observation rather than public announcement. Panic along the delta would scatter witnesses and tip off other poachers who might unknowingly alter the animal's pattern before it could be confirmed. That evening, they set remote thermal cameras along 2 feeder channels entering Blacktooth Bend and installed vibration sensors on cypress trunks partially submerged at the basin edge. The goal was not to capture spectacle. It was to capture movement geometry. Night settled thick and humid, cicadas building into a layered wall of sound before dropping abruptly after midnight. At 1:12 a.m., the first sensor triggered along the northern feeder. The thermal feed showed a large mass entering the basin slowly, hugging the deeper trough. The outline was unmistakable. Broad head, thick torso, tail nearly as long as the body. Kinsey leaned closer to the screen and measured length against known channel markers. 14 feet minimum, possibly 15. The alligator surfaced briefly near the same cypress cluster Maddox had noted the previous night, then drifted forward without fully exposing its back. Minutes later, a second thermal spike registered near the western bank, where the first boat had been found weeks earlier. The animal did not rush. It adjusted position incrementally, holding near the central depression. Maddox watched the timestamps carefully. At 1:26 a.m., a faint light appeared at the edge of the camera frame upstream, a moving beam sweeping low across the water. Poachers. The deputies stiffened, hands resting near holsters. Maddox raised a hand to hold them back. Intervention too early would prevent confirmation. The boat slid into the basin cautiously, spotlight cutting across surface glare in slow arcs. 2 silhouettes leaned forward near the bow, scanning for fish movement. The alligator did not surface immediately beneath the light. It repositioned first. Thermal imagery showed the mass angling along a current seam that would carry scent and vibration from the boat directly toward its position. That was calculation. At 1:31 a.m., as one man leaned farther over the rail to adjust something near the waterline, the mass surged upward. The strike was not visible in full detail on thermal feed, but the water erupted in a vertical column, and the spotlight beam jerked violently sideways before plunging into darkness. The boat rocked hard, then drifted without engine acceleration. One deputy cursed under his breath. Maddox did not move yet. The thermal feed showed the alligator's body roll pattern, tight rotational movement near the surface, followed by immediate drop into deeper pocket. Within seconds, the second silhouette vanished from camera view. No gunshot flash appeared. No secondary struggle on mudbank. The boat remained upright but inert, drifting slowly toward reeds. Maddox exhaled slowly. This was no random attack. The alligator had waited until optimal lean angle, used vertical momentum to destabilize, executed roll, and retreated to known depth refuge. Kinsey whispered what Maddox already understood. This animal had associated boat posture and spotlight angle with feeding opportunity, and had repeated the behavior with precision. Over the next hour, the basin remained still. At 2:14 a.m., the alligator surfaced again near the central depression, jaws breaking water briefly before submerging. Patrol units were dispatched quietly downstream to intercept the drifting boat and recover what remained before current carried it beyond reach. As dawn approached, Maddox stood at the edge of Blacktooth Bend and stared into the opaque water, where the sonar depression lay hidden. 3 disappearances had been assumption. This was confirmation. 1 animal, 1 territory, 1 learned pattern reinforced by illegal night activity. The Delta did not create monsters. It created systems. And this one had been fed repeatedly until it understood that men in aluminum hulls, leaning over black water at night, were no longer unpredictable threats. They were prey that arrived on schedule. By sunrise, the official narrative had already begun to form in the language of reports. Suspected fatal wildlife encounter, ongoing investigation, restricted access to Blacktooth Bend. But Sheriff Cole Maddox understood that paperwork would never fully capture what he had witnessed on thermal feed. This was not a defensive strike by a startled reptile. It was repetition under controlled conditions. The alligator had not attacked the first moment the spotlight touched water. It had waited for lean angle, for vibration shift, for the precise posture that exposed weight distribution along the boat's edge. That level of timing suggested reinforcement over multiple exposures. Illegal night fishing had likely been occurring in that basin for years. Fish blood in water, discarded bait, offal dumped carelessly. Each event small enough to seem harmless, but together enough to condition a dominant male to associate aluminum hull silhouette and artificial light with calories. Maddox convened a closed briefing with Fish and Wildlife and Dr. Kinsey inside the parish substation. Maps of the Delta spread across the table. Kinsey traced current lines with her finger, explaining how scent disperses differently at night when temperature gradients flatten and surface water cools. In still backwater pockets, like Blacktooth Bend, odor and vibration can linger in tight corridors rather than dissipate broadly. A large male holding a deep depression could detect repetitive disturbance patterns and position accordingly. The deputies had recovered the drifting boat before it reached open channel. The bow rail was bent inward nearly 6 inches, metal creased in a crescent that matched vertical impact rather than lateral collision. There were no bullet impacts, no shell casings. Only drag streaks of diluted blood trailing from the stern into the water. Maddox authorized temporary closure of the basin and posted patrol boats at both feeder channels, not as spectacle, but as perimeter control. If the alligator had learned that night boats equaled prey, introducing irregular law enforcement presence might disrupt the pattern long enough to evaluate next move. That night, instead of spotlight rigs and poachers, 2 sheriff boats idled dark just outside the basin while remote cameras remained active inside. The goal was to observe whether the animal would surface without trigger stimulus. At 11:48 p.m., the first ripple appeared near the central depression. The alligator surfaced partially, only eyes and snout breaking water. It drifted in slow arc toward the northern feeder, paused, then turned back. No engine vibration inside the basin, no light beam cutting across water. It was scanning absence. At 12:07 a.m., one deputy accidentally shifted weight too abruptly inside his patrol boat, the hull rocking lightly. The sonar unit registered a subtle vibration spike through the water column. Within 30 seconds, the alligator reoriented toward the source, moving along a seam that would carry disturbance directly toward it. That responsiveness confirmed sensitivity beyond random patrol. The animal was mapping vibration signature changes in real time. Maddox ordered both boats to maintain absolute stillness. For nearly 40 minutes, nothing else happened. Then, unexpectedly, the alligator moved not toward the patrol boats, but toward the western mud bank where the second disappearance had occurred weeks earlier. It surfaced fully for several seconds, exposing length under moonlight. Kinsey measured visually against known cypress spacing and nodded once. 15 feet was likely accurate, possibly older. Scar tissue along the left side of the jaw suggested prior territorial fights. Large dominant males often clear competing smaller gators from core-feeding depressions. Blacktooth Bend likely belonged to this individual exclusively. At 12:59 a.m., a distant engine hum echoed faintly from beyond the restricted zone. Maddox felt his jaw tighten. Despite closure warnings, someone else was running night water. The patrol boats remained in position as a smaller aluminum skiff, lights off, drifted cautiously toward the basin edge. Illegal trotline retrieval likely. Maddox reached for radio, but hesitated. Intercepting immediately would prevent confirmation of whether the alligator would engage under reduced stimulus. The skiff entered the basin at low speed. No spotlight this time. One man leaned over the side to retrieve a floating line marker. No bright beam, but weight shift still clear in water. The thermal feed showed the alligator repositioning from the depression immediately. It did not rush straight line. It moved along the deeper trough first, then angled sharply upward beneath the skiff. The strike that followed was faster than the previous night. Without spotlight glare, the attack relied entirely on vibration and silhouette. The hull lifted nearly a foot as the alligator's head impacted from below. The man at the rail disappeared instantly. The second man attempted to accelerate engine, but lost balance as the boat rocked violently. The alligator rolled once, then twice, tight rotational torque visible in thermal, as concentric rings on the surface. Within seconds, the basin returned to near stillness. The skiff drifted in slow spin, engine idling unattended. Maddox did not hesitate this time. Patrol boats surged forward, lights blazing across the water. The alligator had already retreated to the depression. No dorsal ridge visible, no trailing disturbance. Only a widening ripple where the skiff had been struck. Deputies secured the drifting boat, while Maddox stared into the black center of Blacktooth Bend and felt certainty settle fully. This was no anomaly. This was territorial dominance, reinforced through repeated illegal feeding association. The animal had escalated beyond opportunistic scavenging. It was now actively targeting human posture patterns within its defined basin. And as sirens echoed faintly through distant reeds and deputies secured the perimeter tighter than before, Maddox understood that containment alone would not solve the equation. A dominant predator that has learned timing and leverage within its territory does not relinquish it simply because new boats carry badges instead of bait. The Delta does not negotiate. It absorbs weakness. And somewhere 20 feet down in that depression, the alligator waited, motionless and patient, holding ground that had already proven profitable. By the fourth disappearance, containment was no longer an option. It was a countdown. Sheriff Cole Maddox knew that every additional night, Blacktooth Bend remained open to chance intrusion, increased the probability that someone ignorant of the closures would drift into the basin and repeat the same fatal geometry. The alligator had demonstrated pattern recognition twice under controlled observation. It was not striking randomly along open river stretches. It was holding a defined depression and responding to specific posture cues: lean angle, hull vibration, weight shift over rail. That meant the territory was fixed, and fixed territory could be confronted. Wildlife authorities authorized a removal operation under emergency classification. Not relocation, not monitoring, removal. Dr. Kinsey briefed the team carefully. Large dominant males are strongest at depth, weaker in extended surface pursuit. The key was forcing the animal to commit upward under controlled stimulus, rather than allowing it to choose its own strike timing. Maddox did not like the plan's margins, but margins were already thin. They staged just before dusk, 2 reinforced airboats positioned at opposite feeder channels, heavy-gauge snare rigs anchored to winch frames, harpoon lines prepared as secondary containment. The basin lay flat and dark under a sky bruised purple by late heat. Insects hummed in thick layers above water. Maddox felt the same oppressive stillness he had felt the first night he saw those amber eyes surface in slow arcs. At 9:42 p.m., they initiated controlled disturbance. One airboat idled forward slowly into the basin with lights off, simulating the same low-speed entry the poachers had used. A weighted dummy silhouette, roughly human-shaped and blood-scented from confiscated bait evidence, was secured at the rail and leaned outward deliberately to replicate the precise posture that had triggered previous attacks. The second airboat remained dark along the western bank, ready to cut off lateral escape. For nearly 3 minutes, nothing moved. Then the sonar unit pulsed sharply. A mass rose from the central depression, moving with deliberate acceleration. Not rushed, not chaotic. The thermal overlay showed the alligator angling along the deeper seam exactly as before, calculating approach beneath the boat's lean vector. Maddox watched the monitor and felt the inevitability of repetition. At 9:46 p.m., the water detonated upward beneath the dummy silhouette. The vertical strike lifted the bow, jaws clamping hard onto the weighted form. In the same second, the winch team deployed the snare, steel cable tightening around the upper neck just behind the skull, as the animal initiated its death roll. The torque was violent. The boat lurched sideways as the alligator spun, tail thrashing against the hull with force that rattled teeth in skull. The cable screamed under tension, but held. The second airboat surged forward, adding secondary line pressure before the roll could complete fully. For several seconds, the basin became chaos, black water exploding in arcs, engine roar echoing off cypress trunks, deputies shouting over the noise. Then the rotation slowed. The cable tightened incrementally as the winch drew the massive body upward from the depression. 15 feet was conservative, nearly 16 from snout to tail tip, thick through the torso, scar ridge along the left orbital socket, exactly as Maddox had seen in the dusk light days earlier. The jaws snapped reflexively, even under restraint. Teeth long and yellowed from age and dominance. It took 4 men and reinforced poles to secure the mouth fully and guide the body against the hull. When the struggle finally diminished into exhausted resistance, the basin returned to heavy stillness. Mud swirled upward from the depression where the animal had lived, clouding the water in dark plumes. Maddox stood breathing hard and looked down at the alligator's eyes. There was no frenzy in them, only that same flat territorial awareness. This animal had not hunted out of rage. It had responded to repetition. Men leaning over rails at night had become predictable silhouettes. Each illegal intrusion had reinforced the association. Remove the animal, and the basin would reset eventually. But the delta would not forget the geometry. In the days that followed, official statements framed the events as a rare convergence of illegal activity and dominant wildlife behavior. Blacktooth Bend reopened weeks later, under stricter patrol. Poaching reports in that stretch dropped sharply. Yet long after the removal, locals spoke quietly about the way the basin felt different at night, as if something heavy had been lifted but not erased. Maddox returned once alone at dusk and cut his engine 100 yards out, drifting silently just as he had the first night. The water lay smooth again, current sliding in slow arcs between cypress knees. No amber eyes surfaced this time. No wide head broke the surface to reposition along scent seams. But Maddox understood something fundamental that reports would never carry fully. Predators do not invent behavior in isolation. They adapt to patterns presented to them. Blacktooth Bend had been fed routine until it responded with precision. The Delta did not create a monster. It created a system where men broke rules often enough that something beneath the surface learned how to answer them. And as darkness settled once more over Mississippi marshland, the basin absorbed the silence again, waiting, because in water, that thick and patient, patterns always return when given the chance.